Good morning. Hey, today we're going to show you guys how to use a chop saw, or more commonly referred to as a miter saw. And a miter, as we're going to define it in this class, is any time we cut wood across the grain. So typically, when people think of miter, they think when they cut two pieces at a 45 and fit them together, this would be called a miter. But a miter is actually anything that cuts across the grain of the wood. If you look at this piece, the grain goes up and down. So you can cut across at a 90, which we call a cross cut, or you can do it any other angle. But we're going to use, for the definition in this class, as we're going to call miters anytime we cut across the grain or cross cut something. So what I have here is a 10-inch chop saw. These work really, really well. We have two of them. We have a 10-inch on this side, and right behind the camera there's a 12-inch. They're virtually identical other than the size of the blade. And there's a couple things I like about each one. The 10-inch chop saw is lower to the ground. The handle's closer to the ground. So if you're not as tall, this one works really well. The 12-inch has a bigger blade, so it'll cut through bigger material, but it also has a light on it. And that light, when turned on, shows exactly where the blade's going to cut, which is kind of a nice feature, and it works pretty well. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you kind of the ins and outs of how the saw works, and we'll go from there, okay? So first things first, let's talk about what we can and cannot cut on here. Like I said before, we're going to cut across the grain of the wood here. Never should you put a piece of wood in here like this and cut with the grain. That's just a bad idea. So we're going to cut across the grain of the wood this way. Number two, from this thing here, this big round surface, we have nicknamed the silver dollar. And from the center of the silver dollar to this outside edge is 5 inches. So the shortest board we're going to let you cut at any time is 6 inches. And that means your hand is safely off the silver dollar, out of harm's way, where you can actually hold on to the material in a safe manner. Okay? This is the bed of the saw. That's the flat section. And this part back here that sticks up, this is called the fence. And we have continued our fence in both directions to make sure we have a lot of support. So before you cut anything, you set your material flat against the table or the bed and all the way up against the fence. And that's critical because if your board is sitting out here and you start at the saw and bring it down, as soon as that blade hits that wood, it's going to violently slam it up against that fence, and you do not want to have your fingers between the fence and that board. So we want to make sure the material's flat against the table, up against the fence. Okay? So we have it in place where we want to cut. We always, regardless if you're left-handed or right-handed, we always run this saw with our right hand, no matter what. We're going to take our left hand and we're going to hold on to the material. And what I like to do is I like to be able to grab the material and the fence and squeeze it together so that when I'm bringing the saw down, there's a lot of vibration when you're cutting. If you're not holding on real tight, that board will want to slide on these nice slippery surfaces and your cut may not be exactly where you want it. So if I'm able to clamp onto it and hold it really tight here, as I bring this down, it'll stay in place where it should be. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a sample cut for you. It's down against the bed, up against the fence. I've clamped it with my hands. I'm going to bring this down just so I know exactly where that blade's going to cut. I'm going to lift it all the way up before I start the trigger. The reason I lift it all the way up is if you're halfway up and squeeze that trigger, there's so much torque in that motor that it throws the handle back this way. And the first couple times you're cutting, but just your reaction is that you pull it back down even faster. We don't want to do that. So all the way up position, I'm going to start it. I'm going to make the cut. I'm going to let go with just the trigger, just the button. I'm going to wait till the saw comes to a complete stop, and then I'm going to lift it back up. The reason we don't want to lift that saw blade up while it's still turning is this little tiny piece of scrap wood can vibrate from the upright position to leaning up against that saw blade. And if when you come back up, one of those teeth that catches this edge, it's going to suck it into the saw, bounce it off the concrete cinder wall, and throw it back at you. And we don't want that to happen. So just leave the saw down, okay? I know that when you see mom and dad using these out in the driveway or in the garage, sometimes the blade's still turning when it goes back up. The difference is they're not working a foot away from this big, heavy concrete wall to ricochet the stuff. So when we're here at school, we want to make sure you leave that blade down until it is completely stopped turning, and then you place the saw back up. Don't just let go of it. Put it back in the upward position. The reason we don't let go is there's a spring back here, and we've learned from experience that if you just let go of it, eventually that spring breaks, and it's a real pain to replace. All right, So a couple other rules. Let me see if I have a square handy here. Oh, I'm sure I do. Here we go. So I'm going to use a square. So anytime I mark out, let's say I'm going to mark out a piece that's 8 inches long. So I'm going to take my trusted tape measure, and I'm going to measure from the end of the board on the left. I'm going to measure out 8 inches, and I'm going to put a mark. Now, I really should be using a pencil, but I don't think you'll be able to see the pencil from there. So I measured out 8 inches. I'm going to put a mark with my square. I'm going to actually draw a line, okay? And then, you can see my line there, I think. Then I'm going to put an X just on the right-hand side of that line. And the reason I put that X there is to remind me where that blade should be going. Whenever cutting on the chop saw, you're going to measure from left to right, draw a line, and put an X on the right-hand side. We're going to cut on the right-hand side of that line, so the line should still be there when we're done cutting, but the X should be gone. The reason this is important is every time this saw makes a cut, it's going to take about 1/8 inch of material and turn it into sawdust. And that is called the kerf. The kerf is the amount of material removed by the blade, okay? So I'm going to cut halfway through this board so you can see the kerf. So I got this lined up exactly where I want it. Lift it all the way up. Okay? And so that is the kerf. That's the amount of material that is cut away and turned into sawdust. And if you don't take that into account when you measure stuff, or when you lay your stuff out, so if I had gone 7 inches from here to here and cut on the wrong side of the line, my board would be 1/8 inch too short, okay? So we want to make sure we take into account for that. So that's called the kerf. Always cut on the right-hand side of the line. The speed at which I cut the saw, or how fast I cut and go down through the material, is based on a couple things. Obviously, the type of material. The harder the material, the longer it takes for the saw blades to scrape that material out of the way, so the slower you have to go. And the thicker the material, the longer it's going to take to cut. So be patient, take your time. It's not a race, and just know that the blade will tell you a lot. If you're pulling down and it's hard, you got to slow down a little bit. If you're pulling down and it seems to be cutting through it like it's butter, you can pick up the pace a little bit, okay? All right, next thing. This is a dowel. This is actually an old paint handle that I had at home. You put it on the end of a paint roller, and unfortunately it got stripped, and so I threw it in my bucket of parts and pieces that we use at school. So I have this round dowel. If you're going to cut a round dowel with a chop saw or a miter saw, what we use is called a V-block, and that's nothing more than a huge block of wood that we've cut a V out of. And what we do is we're going to put the dowel inside the V-block. I don't know if you can see that. Let me lower this down a little bit. So we're going to put the dowel inside the V-block, and we're going to cut off the end here. Now when I do this, I typically, you can see all these screw holes. I take a piece of scrap wood, I put it over the top and screw it into the V-block so that the dowel can't roll. And what we don't want is we don't want that dowel spinning on us, and so that's why we don't cut it like this. If I were to put a big dowel like this in the chop saw and come down to cut it, what happens is when the blade hits the top edge of it, it wants to start to turn, and when it starts to turn, it wants to climb right up the back fence and into the saw blade, and that's a bad thing. So we always try to clamp down, and the safest way to do that is put it into a V-block that we then clamp it in the V-block, and see you have all this surface area so it doesn't want to turn when it's locked in place, okay? So if you're cutting something that is a round diameter, we want to use a V-block whenever we cut it, okay? All right, so I think we've kind of covered most everything here. We're going to cut across the grain. The silver dollar is 5 inches. The shortest board you can cut is 6 inches. The speed at which you cut depends on thickness and type of material. Always cut on the right-hand side of the line, and never cut round material without a V-block. Easy to remember. Block of wood with a V cut in. All right, gang. I think that is the chop saw / miter saw. All right. Good luck.